Danielle Allen explores democracy. She's trained as a political theorist and a classicist, and she has 2 PhDs to show for it. She's widely known for her work on justice and citizenship in ancient Athens and also in modern America. Her groundbreaking scholarship over the course of an illustrious but still relatively young career explores core concepts such as equality, freedom, and friendship. And her thinking is reshaping our understanding of American democracy. Her work reveals, however, the distance we still have to go to fulfill the system's promise. To offer just one example of Danielle's important work, I'll mention, as I did in my letter to you, her book, Our Declaration, which offers a close reading of the Declaration of Independence, revealing the equal importance there of the twin values of freedom and equality. She shows that the Declaration insists that only on a foundation of equality can we build meaningful freedom. It's a provocative argument, given the recent popularity in the country of venerating freedom while fastidiously avoiding consideration of its predication on equality in our own founding rhetoric. Something I especially appreciate about Danielle's work as a thinker is the way she draws on ancient and modern history and political theory to articulate what I suppose could be called a ground-level citizens' action plan, observing that citizens in a democracy are supposed to be the drivers and co-creators of a shared world. She crystallizes the knowledge, skills, and capacities that we need to deploy in everyday life if the democracy is to be successful. She encourages us to engage, to get educated, and to put the education into action on the ground. This makes her an ideal speaker for the DeMott Lecture today. The DeMott Lecture honors a revered former professor of English. Benjamin DeMott taught here for 50 years and was widely known for inspiring students to use ideas they learned in the classroom to engage with the world using conscience and courage. This lecture for new students was established in his honor. Danielle Allen is the James Bryant Conant University Professor at Harvard. She's also the director of Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. She's written a very large number of books, including The World of Prometheus, The Politics of Punishing in Democratic Athens, Talking to Strangers, Anxieties of Citizenship Since Brown v. Board of Education, Why Plato Wrote, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in defense of equality and education inequality. And most recently, in 2017, the book we asked you to read, the investigative memoir titled Cuz, The Life and Times of Michael A. And as you know, it traces the tragic story of her cousin Michael, who became entangled in the California carceral system while a teenager in Los Angeles, to devastating effect. In the words of J.M. Coetzee, whose book, The Life and Times of Michael K., Danielle makes reference to with her own title, Cuz, this book shows us, I quote him, what can await you if you are young, Black, and unlucky in today's United States, end of quote. But it does much more than that. It probes questions of responsibility and culpability, asking each of us, as Danielle asks herself, what our role can be, what it must be, in addressing the systemic wrongs the book exposes. It's a special pleasure to welcome Danielle to the podium. Danielle served 2 terms as a trustee of Amherst College. She also chaired an external advisory committee on our work on diversity and inclusion at Amherst. We thank her for making Amherst a much better place and for all the great work she's doing far beyond Amherst and Harvard. Danielle, welcome. Thank you. Good afternoon. You are what? The class of? Awesome. Congratulations and welcome. Biddy suggested that I'm young. I'm not. But I do know the secret to the fountain of youth. And I think it's Amherst College, in fact. I have had the pleasure of spending a lot of time here, and the best part of being here has always been talking to students. So in my personal experience, students at this college in particular, and liberal arts colleges in general, are a fountain of youth for those who are lucky to share time and space with them. So I'm privileged and honored to be with you today. Thank you. And thank you for taking time to read my book. It was a hard book to write. I know it's a hard book to read in many ways. I want to talk today about a little bit of what it took to go into making the book. But before I do that, talk about how it is I came to write it and some of the things I learned from trying to write it, let me just remind you of the general shape of what's in the book. So in September of 1995, my baby cousin, my beloved cousin Michael, was arrested for an attempted carjacking. It was a Sunday morning in Los Angeles South Central, and he had tried to take somebody's car at gunpoint. His victim had wrestled away his gun, shot him through the neck, and that was the end of the attempted carjacking. On the way to the hospital, Michael confessed to having robbed 4 other people at gunpoint that preceding week. This was an incredible outburst of violence. There's no question that it was a string of terrible, violent actions. Yet it came out of the blue. It took us all by surprise. That's not to say there had been no trouble in Michael's life. He had had a shoplifting incident. He had stolen a radio. But this was a just extraordinary acceleration of difficulty. At any rate, you've read the book, so you know what happened. It was California. The state had passed its 3 strikes you're outlaw 2 years earlier. So Michael, in that cluster of incidents, was facing 4 strikes. First arrest. And the judge told him that if he went to trial and was convicted on the things he'd confessed to, he would receive 25 years to life. First arrest. So he took a plea deal, he pled guilty, and he received a sentence of 12 years and 8 months. The judge who sentenced him wrote to the California Corrections Department and recommended that he be kept in juvenile till the latest possible age, which was 25 at that time. But for reasons that cannot be extracted from the California system, he was sent to an adult prison at the age of 17, the first moment he was technically eligible for an adult prison. He was sent to a prison at the Oregon border. His mother was in Los Angeles. Everybody knows that the single thing that makes the biggest difference for successful reentry is family contact. Michael's mother could not visit him in his first 6 months in adult prison at the age of 17. At any rate, the book tells the story of Michael's time in prison. When he was released in 2006, I was, as I always say, the cousin on duty, the one with the time and the resources to try to help Michael reestablish himself. We were super close. We had grown up together. I'm from a huge extended family. You all know what it's like to have cousins, or many of you do. And so the life was a life in Southern California of getting together on family holidays, playing football in the streets together, riding bikes together, climbing trees. My dad's family had 12 siblings, and Karen, my dad's sister, whose mother's Michael, was the youngest of that family. Michael was her youngest out of 3, so he was the baby of a big extended family. My dad and Karen are to this day super close, so our 2 subunits in this big family were really close. Karen and her kids lived with us periodically. My brother and I and her 3 kids were, like I always say, sort of 5 porch steps, each 18 months younger than the previous. And I was the oldest in this set, so you know what that means, right? Like I was the bossy cousin, okay? So yes, so I was the bossy cousin. I grew up with a sense of responsibility for my cousins.
We grew up in a pretty still egalitarian world in the 1970s before the transformations in the country's economy and the criminal justice system drove massive increases in inequality. And sometimes I feel like our story is one in which some of us were on this incredibly rapidly accelerating elevator that just shot us to the top of our social structure, and the others were on elevators that sank. So a family that was close-knit, egalitarian, shared circumstances was wrenched by the transitions of the world that we've all lived in through the last 3 decades. When Michael was released, we worked hard on a job, school, housing. You know that the story ends 3 years after his first release when he was killed by a person he fell in love with in prison. And when you stop and think about it, that makes sense. If you go to prison when you're 15 and spend 11 years there, you're going to fall in love. And the relationships that help you survive that experience will be, in a deep way, indispensable. And yet, the job of seeking reentry is somehow to sever your ties to the people who helped you survive one of the hardest imaginable experiences. I know you've read the book, so I'm not going to say more about the story right now, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. I wanted to say at this point more about what it took to write the book, okay? So the first thing to say is that it took overcoming shame. All right? Michael died in 2009. This book came out in 2017. You might well ask, what the heck took you so long? What took you so long to tell this story? And the fact of the matter is that when Michael died, it was devastating for our entire family. And not one of us talked about what happened with any of the rest of us. Even Michael's mother and siblings didn't talk about what had happened. It wasn't until I decided that I did need to try to tell this story that we actually finally took the time to figure out what had happened. The reason I did decide to tell the story, a couple of reasons. One was I had Michael's essays and letters, and they were just in a box, like a voice, caught in a box, pulsing, just beaming at me. We'd always thought Michael would tell his own story. He loved to write. You know that from the book. We always thought he would tell his own story. And there was that voice trapped in a box. And I was invited to give these lectures at Harvard called the Dubois Lectures. They're named after W.E.B. Du Bois, the greatest African-American sociologist of the late 19th and early 20th century, incredible political thinker. The job of those lectures is to provide commentary on the state of affairs for African Americans in the US in the contemporary moment. I said yes, it was an honor to be asked, and every time the date got near, I kept canceling. The date would come and I would give Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., who had invited me, a title, an abstract title of some kind, political equality and justice in the 21st century, or African Americans and rights in the 21st century, and the date would get closer and I would cancel. And I finally realized that I couldn't possibly pretend to comment on what has happened to African Americans in the US in the late 20th and early 21st century without coming to understand my cousin's story and telling his story. Okay? But to do that, I had to lift a rock of silence off of his story. And I want to stop and ask you to think about that for a minute, that rock of silence, because you all know the statistics. About 2.25 million people are incarcerated in America right now. Another 5 million are under supervision of the criminal justice system in the form of bail or probation or some other thing of that sort. So 7 million people right this very second are directly affected by the criminal justice system in the sense of being under its supervision. Now, each of those 7 million people is presumably related to at least 4 other people. Shall we say, maybe? It's a random, you're picking a number here. 35 million people right now directly affected by the criminal justice system. Okay? More than 10% of the country. Have you heard 35 million such stories? How many have you actually heard? That's the rock of shame, suppressing all those stories. When I gave the lectures finally telling Michael's story, I think they were the strangest lectures Harvard has ever seen, because I wept. I stood in front of like a big scholarly audience, and I cried for 3 lectures straight, because it was the first time I myself was processing what had happened in my own family. The most surprising thing for me about those lectures was that afterwards, the number of people who came up to me of all races and said, I have a family member in prison, and I've never told anyone. And that was, in fact, my situation. For all the time I was helping Michael with school, getting him college classes, talking to him on the phone, almost every week while I was a professor at the University of Chicago and dean at the University of Chicago. And even when I went out to California to help him, living there, working all through the summer with him, I never told a single one of my professional colleagues. This was one of the most important relationships in my life, and I never told the people I lived and worked with. We can't fix problems if we don't lift that boulder of shame. Okay? So that's the first thing I wanted to say about what it took to write the book. And interviews with family members were incredibly powerful experience. But I want to say something else too, because the fact that you're at this college is a special thing. And it gives you special opportunities and special responsibilities. And the reason I say that is because it will give you the tools to tell true and important stories in ways that can change the world. And so that's what I want to talk about now, all right? Because writing a memoir, sometimes people just think it's about like looking into your soul, talking to the people that you know, figuring out all those stories. But no, okay? It takes serious, hardcore research. Let me explain how. It's not as if Michael's story, the narrative, was just sitting there ready to be written out, the story of what happened to him. So yes, I had to interview people, but I had to do that rigorously. I had to compare different points of view, figure out who was distorting which kinds of evidence in which way, all the tools of ethnography that you would learn in a class in anthropology, for example. Okay? It takes work to get those stories right. And it took work to get his court records. So the book involved just good old-fashioned shoe leather reporting. All right? Michael's mother had thrown away all of his court papers after he died. Not super surprising, right? This was a really big, bad part of her life. Those papers were all gone. What did it take to get them back from the state of California? What would you do if you wanted to get court records if somebody was deceased? What do you do? Well, it turns out, so California is pretty good. All court proceedings are public, actually. You can walk into a court in downtown Los Angeles and request any criminal court case and get the records from it, except juvenile records, okay? Except juvenile records. Juvenile records are confidential for very, very good reason, to protect juvenile offenders. However, if a juvenile offender is deceased, then there's not a soul on the planet who has a right to see that file. The deceased's mother doesn't have a right. No relative has a right. It's trapped by the state, all right? In addition, in this instance, I learned this fact that the file was trapped, but as it happened, it didn't even matter because they didn't know where it was. They couldn't find it, all right? So they gave me this piece of paper that listed different places the file had been, and I got in my little rental car, and I drove all over Los Angeles from one court to the next. Have you seen this file? It says here you saw it 13 years ago. Where is it now? One place to another. Sprawling bureaucracy of the state. It's like Kafka. All these boxes with papers in the hallways, nobody knowing exactly where anything is. And finally, I got to my last stop on my journey, a court called the Airport Court. It's called that because it's near LAX. And I was like, on my piece of paper, like, you're the last place this file was. You guys saw this file. I know you did. And behind the plexiglass, the woman says, no, we don't have it. We don't have it. It's like, I've been to all the other courts, and they all say it came here, and nobody ever says it went anyplace else. I'm pretty sure you have it. And she said, well, now that you mention it, there is a stack of old juvenile files down in the basement. Let me just go check. So I wait, tick, 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 tick. She comes up behind the plexiglass, this nice big fat file. She's like, I found it. And I stretch about my hands to the plexiglass, and she says, wait, let me just go take out everything that's stamped confidential. So she goes around the corner, and I wait. 20 minutes, and she comes back with a file like this. And I was like, oh, that was painful. Okay, so then what do I have to do? Well, you can make the state level equivalent of a Freedom of Information Act request, so that's what I did. I wrote and I said, may I please have the contents of file, blah, 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 with a number. And I got back a letter that said, we're sorry, you have to request the specific documents you want. I was like, well, that's interesting, because how do I know what's in the file if I haven't seen the file? So at that point, I engaged a lawyer. Okay, it's the only thing I could do. And the lawyer said, well, look, here's the list of the kinds of documents that are typically in a file, so request those. So that's what I did, and that's what I got. And that was the best I could do. I couldn't get everything because I had no way of knowing what other stuff was in the file, right? But I got enough to verify the story as I pieced it together from interviews and to figure out a few other things, too, that I hadn't already known. But the point of that is that I learned how to do this, research things seriously, at the place I went to college. I like to call it the Amherst of New Jersey, Princeton, all right? But that's what you guys are gonna get here, the ability to find stuff out where other people would stop and give up and they wouldn't get to the truth, all right? So that's a key piece of it. Another key piece of it is something that you get from the social sciences, okay? I wanna, two more pieces actually here of the writing that matters. So when we think about criminal justice in this country, we have a tendency to veer back and forth between stories that say, it's the fault of the system, it's the fault of the individual, the wrongdoer. Either the system's to blame or the individual's to blame. Now this is just, at the end of the day, patently absurd, okay? Michael made bad choices. He bears responsibility. We, his family, failed to do right by him. We bear responsibility. And the laws and society and social structure bear responsibility. I've come to think of it as an issue of the degree of difficulty any young person confronts, all right? So I don't know if you remember the last Olympics, but there was a gymnast who, her name was Kara Makar, something like that was her last name. She was from India, and she was gonna do a move called the Pradhanova. Is there any gymnast in here who knows this move? This is like the greatest degree of difficulty move in gymnastics. It's a vault of some kind. And the thing about this move, the coverage, the media coverage, had this constant narrative of, is she gonna make it, or is she gonna break her back? Is she gonna make it, or is she gonna break her back? She made it, good news. But that's a good way of capturing the relationship between social circumstances and individual responsibility. When there's a high degree of difficulty, people can make it, but most people are going to break their backs. And that's what we have to ask about our laws, is how are they distributing degrees of difficulty to young people in different contexts and circumstances? Now, but to think about responsibility this way is somewhat different than the convention. And if you read a lot of investigative journalism, you'll find that the narrative over and over again is, something went wrong, there was a child care facility, the children got abused, there was an elder care facility, the elders got abused, there ought to be a law, somebody ought to do something about it, there ought to be a law. And that's the dynamic over and over again. If something goes wrong, the state's at fault, there ought to be a law. And there are sort of social science frameworks that generate that causal narrative. I didn't want that causal narrative. I wanted to tell a different kind of story about the relationship between laws and social structures, opportunity and individual responsibility. So I had models from economics about game theory and equilibrium states and incentive structures. I had to invent narratives that could render those economic theories of causation in narrative form. Okay? Now, that's not going to make a lot of sense now because you haven't had all of your economics and social science classes. But the point that I want to make here is that what you're learning in those classes will affect how you tell stories. Stories and scholarship go together and reinforce each other, okay? And it's important sometimes that we break through some of our old habits for how we tell stories to get to new understandings of what's happening in the world. And funnily enough, even our really quantitative courses in the social sciences can help us figure out new ways of telling stories, okay? Now here's the last piece I want to share of what made this book possible, and to some extent something about why it took so long to write it. So many years ago, because I'm not as young as Biddy was suggesting, I was sitting in college in my sophomore year. I took a course on Athenian history. So some of you may take some courses on the ancient world. And I was reading page after page of Athenian court documents, legal speeches, prosecutions, defenses, and so forth. And one day I put my hand up in class and I said, didn't these people use prisons? After all, I'd grown up in Southern California in the 70s and 80s, and prisons had been growing all around me. I couldn't imagine a world where there weren't just like lots of people going to prison. And my professor said, that would make a great dissertation topic. All right, now what was that professor doing in that moment? I brought a question to my materials in my Princeton class that reflected my own personal experience as a young person in Southern California. I had a perspective on our world and how it was changing that was putting urgent questions on the table. In other words, in the late 80s, before the phrase mass incarceration was a phrase, I had questions about it. And I had questions about it just because I was a thinking, feeling person taking my world in. Every single one of you has questions like that. Every single one of you is asking questions about our world that the old people aren't asking yet. And we need you to hear those questions and follow through on them. And the faculty here, if they're like my professor, will say when they hear your questions, great question, follow that line. And because my professor said that, I did go write a dissertation on punishment in ancient Athens. And I've been thinking about punishment for many years, and I have studied punishment from antiquity to the present and around the world, which puts me in the position to say with authority that the world has never seen a penal system like the one this country has built. All right? But it took my education to put me in a position to say that with authority. All right? There's much more to be said about that. We have to take responsibility as a country for the penal system that we've built. It is a part of American exceptionalism. One of the things we've delivered to the world. We have to look at that squarely. To look at it squarely, we have to hear the stories. That requires lifting the boulder of shame. Right? The reason being with college students is a fountain of youth is because you always have great questions. And so the part of all of this that I've been most looking forward to is the chance to talk with all of you. So thank you so much for spending time with my book, for listening to Michael's story. I'm really looking forward now to your questions. Thank you. So I think there's a mic up here, and possibly there's a mic upstairs as well. And I'm happy to talk about any of the parts of the book. Michael's story, my experience in writing it, the issue of drug policy, the issues of criminal justice reform. So whatever has captured your curiosity, I welcome. Please just, if you don't mind, if you could share your name and where you're from, that would be lovely.
I'm Teo. Can you hear me with the mic?
Teo?
I'm from Georgia.
Great.
One of the really compelling parts of the book for me was how you use language, how you sort of changed the sort of language that you used when you were talking about different ideas, when you were sort of trying to maybe elicit a different way of thinking. It was really compelling for me that you must have been struggling in writing the book with emotions, I guess, like anger, disappointment, contempt for a lot of things. And especially by the end of the book, it got extremely intellectual, it got extremely factual. How did you reconcile those two sorts of feelings? Having it personal, but having it so accessible, having it so universal, having it so, there on the page for us to see, even though we haven't had that experience.
Thank you. It's a great question. Can I impose by just reading a tiny bit to you? Would that be all right? This is a way of answering your question. So I apologize for those of you who are standing in line, because it means you're going to be standing ever so slightly longer, but I'll try not to take too long. I just want to read you a little passage from the chapter called Visiting 1.0. Okay? And then...
Actually what I was talking about.
Oh, really? Perfect. Well, then you picked it up already. Good. So you'll remember this chapter. Let's see. If many of my memories of Michael's time in prison involve coaching him over the phone through his writings about canonical texts, a good portion of the rest involve long visits with him, and most often with my Aunt Karen, in Norco's bare-bones visiting room and prison yard. These visits possessed an emotional rhythm, the sense of steeling yourself against the difficult as you started the early morning drive from LA, the rising anticipation as you got closer, the quiet joy of the visit, and the aching disappointment that inevitably came with departure, with leaving one's loved ones still inside. Once one arrived at the prison, visits had an intensely ritualistic quality, the underlying purpose of which is control. You might want to say control of the inmates or control of their families, but that wouldn't seem quite right. The target of the rituals felt more indiscriminate. The object is simply control in its own right. As Michael, known to the system as K10033, wrote, inmates went by numbers, not names, and visiting days were allocated to sets of numbers. Half of the evens on one Saturday, half of the odds on Sunday, the other halves of each set the following week. At 7:30 a.m., the guards would let a parade of Kias and Hyundais, Chevys and Dodges into the parking lot, and then you would sign in at a lectern at the front of a canopied structure with wooden benches that looked something like a tent revival meeting. Hosts of mainly black and brown women, but white women too, and many children, and some men, flitted in the shadows under the canopy. We could take in up to $30 in quarters or singles in plastic baggies, and we always took the maximum. The point of this was to purchase treats for the inmates from the row of vending machines dispensing, as it turned out, quite disgusting microwavable cheeseburgers and burritos, along with mystery meat plates. It also mattered how you dressed. You couldn't wear blue denim because that's what the inmates wore. You couldn't wear beige or khaki because that's what the guards wore. You couldn't wear tight clothes or clothes that showed cleavage or skirts shorter than 2 inches above the knee or sleeves shorter than 2 inches below the shoulder. If you were dressed wrong, you weren't let in. You always took a backup set of clothes just in case. If there was a focal point of the control, I suppose it was the attempt to target desire. My editor did not like this chapter. All right? My editor thought I should take it out. And I couldn't quite figure out why, and he kept saying, well, but you're not in this chapter, Danielle, you're not there. And I was like, what do you mean? You're like, for $30 and plastic baggie? That's like a really concrete detail from my memory that I'm giving you. And we went round and round and round, and finally I understood what he meant. And that resulted in a chapter called Visiting 2.0. Okay, this is the sense which is an answer to your question. Time for my own confession. I wrote that last chapter like an academic, which I am. The description of visiting that I gave you wasn't about me. It was about some disembodied you. To write that chapter, I stepped into the perspective of an outside observer, the luxury afforded to academics when they travel the world encountering pain and injustice. To be an academic is to acquire an excuse for not owning the pain you see. Take a look again at what I wrote. Visits had an intensely ritualistic quality, the underlying purpose of which is control. You might want to say control of the inmates or control of their families, but that wouldn't seem quite right. The target of the rituals felt more indiscriminate. The object is simply control in itself. Abstraction, distancing, those are my first tools of self-protection. Athena's spear and shield. I will have to try again to describe what visiting Michael meant to me. The fact that I told you the story as an academic already tells you everything you need to know. That wound of visiting Michael in prison goes so deep that somehow, even in writing this book, I have found it hard to own up to one simple fact. I went to prison. I was in prison. No, I don't mean that I've been arrested or convicted of a crime. I have avoided that because thus far in life, I've had that combination of goods that the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle thought was necessary for a happy life: resources, decent character, and luck. My father and mother gave me the first two items from that treasure chest. The Lord my God, whom I believed in as a child and then did not believe in, and then came to believe in again as I emerged from periods of great pain, has given me the third. All right, so now you know more about me than anybody other than my husband. But no, I was not in prison as a convict, and this is thanks to my father, my mother, and my God. Yet even as someone who could come and go, I felt the prison's mark, its branding fork. I felt it in my soul, even though all I was there was a day's sojourner. So the answer to your question is, a good editor helped a lot, who called me out when I was being an academic. In that first chapter, I'd written the whole book up to that point saying I. And then in that chapter, I started saying you do this, you do that. I was deflecting, and he called me on it. So the point is, friends, people you talk to, who call you on it when you're not being honest, okay? That was the thing I needed in order to work through this, and all of it was about, in various ways, working through screens to honesty. And again, friends are what make the difference fundamentally for that. I think we've got some questions up top too, so let's go back and forth between the two mics if that's okay. So there's a question up here.
Hello.
Yep.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello.
Oh, good afternoon, Dr. Allen. Jonathan Paul from Trinidad and Tobago here.
Welcome.
Hi. Just wanted to know what made you decide to split the book into 3 separate parts, and what was the distinction between the first, second, and third parts in your mind?
Great question. It's funny because people really tend not to like the fact that the book goes backwards through time, which is really surprising to me because I'm like, we watch movies like that all the time, people. It's like, why can't we read a book that works the way a movie works? But anyway, it's a very straightforward answer. The title of the book, Cuz, it just came to me one night as I was trying to figure out how I was going to write about my cousin. And it just popped into my head. I think of it as a one-word poem. And that's, Michael called me cuz, I was his cousin, but it was because I realized that the thing that was pushing at me so hard was the need to answer a series of why questions. Why had he ended up dead? Why was he in prison for so long? And then the hardest question, why, oh why, had he ended up on that corner holding a gun, this beloved kid whom we were all committed to and doing so much to try to ensure had a good life? Why did that happen? So in some sense, the questions are in a kind of just logical sequence. And they also go, in some sense too, from the easiest to the hardest question. And then of course, it's an interesting just detail that I had drafted the whole thing with this structure of cuz that I was working on, the whole thing. And then I learned, only after I'd already written a first draft, that cuz is also what members of the Crips call each other. I wrote this whole book without knowing that, okay? And then I figured that out just as I was finally figuring out how the pieces of the year before he went to prison came together, and then I'd go back and rework everything, right? So the word itself was a mysterious gift that gave me a structure. Thank you. Oh gosh. See, I told you, fountain of youth. If you get a question, you answer it, you get applause, that keeps you young. Thank you, Pete. It's really sweet of you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Allen, for your lecture and for taking the time to answer our questions first. So my name is Jorge, and I'm from Cary, North Carolina.
Great.
And like you reiterated before, family matters.
Yeah.
Family matters a lot. And I wanted to get your aspect on Michael in terms of family, so here's my question. How do you think that the presence or the absence of a constant father or a father figure could have benefited Michael, or how did it hurt Michael during his teenage years, especially leading up to his first incarceration?
Thank you. That's an important question. So there's a lot to say there, and I want to say another thing about shame here. So another silence that affects the story is the silence around the physical violence that Karen and her kids experienced. There were many things that were shocking to me as I worked on this story, but one of the most shocking was just literally how much violence had been in their lives. So when Karen married her husband, I think I call him Henry in the book, is that true? Thanks, okay. It's dangerous because every now and then his real name almost pops out of my mouth. When Karen marries Henry, and they moved, and we could see the trouble, we could see them moving, we knew something was wrong. And Karen and my dad are super close. To this day, they speak almost weekly. They were communicating, but Karen never told him that there was physical violence, okay? There's a lot of shame around domestic violence, shame about relationships that don't work. So what I'm trying to say is, there's no question that Michael loved Henry, actually, and losing Henry was very devastating to him. And in general, a healthy, stable home is a necessary thing for any child. That said, a father figure, it's not the father figure that matters, it's the healthy, stable adult that matters being there. And when a relationship between two people is full of violence, then the combined parenting figures can't, it won't work, it doesn't work. So the point is just that, yes, two parents are better than one parent when that's a healthy, stable dynamic. One parent is better than two when the dynamic is not healthy.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Eva Nelson, and I'm from Southern California, specifically Riverside, but I did live in LA for a few years, so I'm really familiar with the areas. And my question is, did you get a sense, well, at the time when you were working with Michael after he came out of prison, that the pressure became too much in order to follow through on all of his promises when he was trying to assimilate back into just regular society from being in prison? And if so, did you ever talk to him about it? And do you think that could have prevented some of his spiral downward?
Yeah. So, thank you. That's another important question. And it goes with the previous one in the sense that I think in order for families to do their jobs as families, one of the most important things is talking even about things that people feel shame about. Right? And for me, that's one of the biggest lessons that comes out of this, because if at various points in time we had all actually talked about things that we were noticing or worried about, I think things would have been very different. And certainly when Michael comes out, I mean, sort of a piece of guilt that I bear is, retrospectively, that Michael was very, very talented, without any question. He excelled academically when he was in school. Even in the context of prison, he was able to write, really powerful essays and so forth. And so I am sure that my own ambitions for a person with those kinds of gifts meant that I did not fully see him and who he was. And I failed to give him the space to tell me who he was so that he would be setting his own course. That's a mistake that I made, without any doubt. So yes, in various ways these things came out, but not in the fullness and directness that they should have done. Thanks. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ryan. I am from around Toronto in Canada, and I actually have two questions. So if you only want me to
ask your
one.
friends. What do you think? What do your friends think? Yeah, all right.
Okay. So my first question is actually related, more closely to just us here. I think in several times in the book you sort of touched upon by being an academic and being separated from the world of this sort of Paris state, you weren't able to get know or understand a lot of what was happening until actually researching in depth afterwards. So my question is sort of like, as Amherst College students, how can we sort of involve ourselves and try to help directly impact those issues, like even right here?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So there are lots of things to say. I mean, I spent some time in the book talking about the issue of drug control policy, right? And the fact that the U.S. has a $100 billion market for illegal narcotics. That's what the number was like 5 years ago, so presumably it's somewhat bigger now. But at any rate, there are several important things about that. Because it's illegal, people can't really do research on it. So one of the reasons we have trouble getting our heads around this sort of major social problem is because of how hard it is to do research. People are starting to crack that open, and there's more scholarship coming out in that zone. I think that's actually a really important thing. So that's sort of one thing, is that there's stuff we can know that we don't know that it will be good to know. Then there is a huge reform movement underway, and it's bipartisan. We're in an extraordinary moment, actually, where there's a real chance to transform our criminal justice system. Just to give you one sort of factoid. So in the US, 70% of our criminal justice sanctions are incarceration. Anybody know what the number is in Germany? What percentage of their sanctions are incarceration? 6%. Okay, in the Netherlands, 10%. The point is that there's actually a viable alternative for running a criminal justice system that doesn't depend on incarceration. They start from the premise that incarceration is bad for people, and if your goal in punishment is to make the victim whole, make the community whole, make the wrongdoer whole so they can contribute productively to society, incarceration is not actually the tool you want to use. Okay, so in other words, if you want people to re-enter and be productive in society, you need a very different approach to sanctioning. And it's not a utopian thing to say that. You can buy a plane ticket and go learn what it's like. So I think just plain learning about those alternatives and starting to share knowledge and research and scholarship about those alternatives would be a very serious contribution.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And for my second question, it's actually sort of related to what you were talking about. In your book, you also put a lot of emphasis on sort of the war on drugs and also past drug policy for creating the sort of Paris state that allowed Michael to be incarcerated and put into the situation that he was put into. My question is, why drugs particularly? That like, couldn't it have been some other like illegal thing?
$100 billion, my friend.
Yeah, but like my point is like, because it could have been like some other thing, doesn't that point to a more like systemic problem not related to the drugs, but like more
$100 billion is a systemic problem. Here's the thing you have to ask yourself. How do you enforce contracts in a black market?
What?
With guns. Literally. That's just a fact about black markets. You can't use a legal system to enforce contracts. A $100 billion market depends on contracts just like any other market. All right? So we have baked into our social structure a $100 million market that depends on guns for contract enforcement. There's no other policy as distorting of our basic legal institutions as that, I would argue. And so if there is another one that's equally distorting, let me know. Tell me what you find.
Okay. Well, I'm going to stop hogging the mark now.
Thank you for your questions. I appreciate it. Yeah, sorry. Thank you for reminding me. Yeah.
So my name is Colin, and I'm from New York City. And so when I read a book, and I get to the end of that book, and I think this is true about some people, maybe not others, I feel a certain finality in the ending of that book. Yet when I got to the end of Cuz, I thought, this is not an ended story. There's something that's going to change about this, whether it's, the factors that affected Michael's story or whether it's Michael's story itself, because as you said, there are still documents that are not available to you. And so I'm curious, if and when this information changes or the world changes, if you feel sort of the need to address that in writing, again with another book or in another way? And, how?
Thank you. Well, I think the single thing there's two things in Michael's story I'm still curious about. I don't think it would require changing the story, but I just would like to know the answers. One is this issue of why he got moved to adult prison when he did, and they presumably did some kind of psychological assessment that was beneath that. I would really like to have those materials. And then the second feature of his story that just makes me sad that I don't have is that over the course of his incarceration, he wrote several times to the judge who sentenced him. I really wanted those letters, and I couldn't get them. So I'm very curious about those. Michael speaking in his own voice, presumably about his legal situation. The bigger issue in some sense is the question you asked about broader social context, where things are changing. So California, in the last couple of years, via a ballot initiative, revised their 3 strikes, you're outlaw. Most people didn't know you can get multiple strikes from a single incident, right? So for example, that attempted carjacking was 2 strikes for Michael. And in various other ways too, the way it operated, if your 3rd strike, it could be a very, very minor offense, yet it could be a nonviolent minor offense, and yet it would put you away for life. So they've taken those kinds of features out of the law, and in general, again, there's sort of bipartisan effort to change things. So they've reduced, the number of people in prison is actually now coming down. It's been coming down for about 3 years. And so this is great news. There's a lot more work to do, without any question. But the direness of the picture that pertained even 6 or 7 years ago, is starting to ever so slightly come down. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I do think that we are turning a corner as a society. And so for me now, the question is how to make sure we follow through on that work. We can't stop now. You gotta keep your eye on that set of questions. Thank you. Yes.
First of all, I want to thank you so much for coming and sharing your story. I think we all really appreciate hearing this perspective. I'm Nicole. I'm from just outside Boston. Okay. And throughout the book, you sprinkled in all these beautiful excerpts from Michael's writings. And I was particularly struck, though, by the longer narrative from his time firefighting in California. And I just kind of wanted to know, I felt that it was a very humanizing part of the novel, but I just wanted to know from your perspective as author and even biographer, why you put that in there.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I put it in there just because it was, probably like you, I felt like it was one of the things that most brought him out as a person. It's not an academic piece of writing. For the Inferno essay and the Chaucer essay, he was trying to do school writing, whereas for the firefighting, it was really just Michael kind of recounting his experiences. So there was that. It's challenging because the actual text was literally, I think I refer to this in the book, he typed it up in all caps with no paragraph breaks. It's just this one continuous text. I would have loved to have printed it like that, but you just can't do that in a book. It would be unreadable. But there were just things like that it was just very alive as an expression of him and his experience. I think you put your finger on it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Cole. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Welcome.
Thank you. So throughout the book, there is the idea of changing spirituality. Yours especially is hinted at, but Michael's is talked about. How has the experience guided how you view your spirituality?
Thank you. That's a great question. So colleges and universities are on the whole not places that foreground religious spirituality. I think there's a lot of attention to the spirit, but not necessarily to religious spirituality. And so this book is a coming out book in a lot of ways. It's a coming out book because I had all these colleagues that I'd never told for years what I was spending my time doing. In fact, after the book came out, I had one friend from my time at the University of Chicago who wrote to me and said, "Now I know why you never accepted my invitations to do things." Right? So she invited me to go on weekend trips or whatever else, and I never accepted. And like suddenly the light bulb went off. So for me, this book too, in saying, to the world, I'm a believer, is a coming out book. So the process, but this is about the honesty point again, right? About the things that we hide as a part of functioning in professional life, the need to try to get beyond that, and the need also to build inclusive environments where people can be their full selves, be fully present in places like this, in professional organizations and so forth. So did that make sense as a response? A little bit? Okay. Thanks.
Hello. Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm from New York City. I was wondering if it's okay if I do 2 questions. Right.
Yep, they say so. Yep.
So my first one is, like you mentioned, kind of the stigma people feel around confessing that they have a family member who is involved in the criminal justice system. But I was wondering more broadly, like, how does the language we use to talk about criminal justice, incarceration, inmates, and punishment as a whole perpetuate sort of the toxic function of that system?
Right. So one of the features of my book that I would do differently actually now, even just a short period on, is I do use the word inmate in the book. Whereas I now, when I talk about the issue of incarceration, I talk about incarcerated people. And I do think that's important. Michael, as it happened, used the language of inmate for himself and his fellows. So there was a reason for my using that language, but at the end of the day, I do think it's important to talk about incarcerated people. Yeah. And what's your second question?
So I don't know if this is like obvious, but throughout the book, it seems that like the criminal justice system is really kind of disorganized. People don't really know what's going on, and it's also, as far as I know, very expensive. So I'm wondering, like, what is preventing reform? And since studies show that rates of recidivism decline as criminal justice systems get reformed.
Right. So that's a big and complicated question. So one answer to that is the U.S. has an incredibly complex system. So we have a federal criminal justice system, and then we have the 50 state jurisdictions. And they're all structured somewhat differently, which means you have to have 51 different bodies of expertise. You actually need a reform plan, 51 different reform plans. So we're starting to build up that expertise, but it's been a little slow in coming. So that's one thing. And then another thing is just that, for example, there are 2 important bills in Congress at the moment. The Senate has something called the Corrections Reform Act, I think, which is co-sponsored by Chuck Grassley, Republican from Iowa, and Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois. And then the House has something called the First Steps Act, which is a prison reform act, which is supposed to shorten people's sentences and help people transition to halfway houses and apprenticeships instead of incarceration. And the interesting thing about these acts is, for example, in the Sentencing Reform Act, there's a certain effort to reduce sentence time, but both Durbin and Grassley, who are of another generation, are really against marijuana legalization. Okay? Now, there is one just very straightforward way to reduce sentences, and that's to legalize marijuana. All right? And so those 2 policy areas have been kind of operating separately and not come together. And a lot of this is about generational differences. So that's another place where we really need work, is to actually bring together the kind of drug policy reform conversation, the substance use disorder conversation, which sees substance use as a health issue, not a criminal justice issue. Bring that together with the people who are working on the criminal justice part of it, the bail part of it, the probation part of it, and stuff like that. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, sorry, up top.
I'm Diego Rao from Boston. So people who feel oppressed by a certain system will often turn to options outside that system, as we've seen in 2016 with the political system people turn to outsiders like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders on both sides of the aisle. So because of the market disparities and how people of different races are treated by the government in the U.S., that's the official state, to what extent do those disparities strengthen and reinforce the parastate that you wrote of, and how can we reform our society to try to keep more young people from joining the millions lost, as you wrote?
Yeah, no, thank you. Yes, no, I mean, I think that is a part of the issue. I mean, I'm kind of a one-note Nelly on this one because I think, in contexts where young people face particularly challenging circumstances, they need more economic opportunity and they need more basic safety. And even the question of quality of schools depends on safety issues. And I'm not talking about putting guns in schools. I mean those contexts where students are trying to walk to school and are not safe walking to school. And they need public safety in those contexts. And I do think that, this is sort of one of the things that comes out is, again, the structure of our drug laws leads to, I would say, a massive misallocation of policing and public safety resources. And so, whereas what we really need is to have criminal justice resources targeted to the worst crimes, to violent crimes, and so forth, we don't actually have that because there's so much energy going into just sort of lower levels of interdicting contraband and stuff like that. And then prosecutors are overloaded with too many drug cases. So at any rate, the short of it is just that although I would like to say there's some other solution one could look to for rebuilding opportunity for young people or, making sure the education system is really sound, at the end of the day, I don't actually think we can succeed in any of those things if we don't take the sort of just really significant black market out of the picture.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kat. I'm from Gainesville, Florida. My question is, for those like me who have a family member who's incarcerated.
Bravo. Well done. That was very brave. Thank you.
How do you begin to lift that rock of silence? How do you reach out and make a connection with someone that your parents maybe have never really let you talk to? How do you, become a part of their life in a way that can make a positive change to them? And how do you change your family members' views on what needs to be kept in silence? So I was told to never repeat that because someone could look us up and find out about it.
Right.
And how do you change that culture and become more open in discussing, what went wrong, how people, something goes wrong with mental health and how bad things can happen? How do you start that dialogue and lift that silence?
You've just done it, so thank you. And you can keep doing it. And I think you answered your own question at the end of your remarks with the comments you made about mental health. So I think working on issues of mental health and thinking about how we can build a health system that's adequate to addressing issues of mental health would make a very great difference for very many people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Am I next?
I think you must be last. I sort of saw our friend Austin going around whispering in people's ears, and so I think that I think you're the last question.
Cool. So I'll try to make it a good one. I won't waste it.
Exactly.
So hey,
Hamilton, not throwing away your shot.
Yeah, no. I'm Andy. I'm from Brownsville, Texas, the Rio Grande Valley. So correct me if I'm wrong, please. In your book, you talk about kind of this like past the point of no return. To fix things, legalize hard drugs. Is that correct?
Decriminalize hard drugs. It's legalize marijuana and decriminalize the others, which means convert basic, ordinary level use and possession into misdemeanors, not felonies. So hard drugs remain illegal, but the things that are felonious are the serious level trafficking, and the ordinary sort of use and possession is a misdemeanor, and people are directed to health services, not the criminal justice system.
Okay, cool. So in the book, you talk about that, and I agreed with that. Now, in your expertise and what you know, because you know a lot more than me.
Only about some things. You know more about some
what
things
would
than I
be
do.
the scope of that consequence? I mean, it would be a positive consequence of that decriminalization.
I believe so. So basically, the policy is one that Portugal has undertaken. So it's legalizing marijuana and decriminalizing things like cocaine, opioids, and stuff like that. The goal of such a policy is to, again, concentrate criminal justice resources on the highest level traffickers and to otherwise be directing people who are in a use situation into health services. In the Portuguese case, they've been doing this for about 10 years now, and they've seen a decline in adolescent drug use, an increase in people seeking addiction treatment, and actually increased quantities of contraband interdicted. So that's all good news. There's some other things to kind of know about it. Another advantage actually of the combination of legalizing and decriminalizing is that it makes it much easier to do research on the medical consequences of use. So it's important to say that, you know, to argue for legalization and decriminalization is not to argue for like party time. Like that's not the policy, okay? And even marijuana is not, strictly speaking, a safe drug. People with a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia are triggered to schizophrenia by marijuana, okay? Most people don't know that, but that is a medical fact. So, and these are the kinds of facts about narcotics that we would actually be able to better understand and better promulgate if things were legal. Just want to say one last thing on this policy point, and I know I'm running over at this point, but just to say, it's also worth noting that this is an international policy issue. So for those of you who are interested in international relations, you should be paying attention too. The countries of Central America and South America would like to change to this model. They sponsored a UN meeting about 3 years ago to try to get the UN to change its policy to this model. The last UN meeting on the subject of drug control was in the late 1980s. The paradigm the UN has is the US paradigm of the war on drugs. The change was blocked by Russia, okay? So Russia, Iran, the US have the same approach to drug control, all right? And currently, a Russian holds the role, which is the director of the Office of Drug Control and International Trafficking. This is a huge global issue because it's a global supply. As it happens, the US is 1/3 of the global market for narcotics, all right? So the whole global picture really depends on what we do here. And please notice, people, the reason we have people seeking asylum on our border is because the devastation to the legal systems of Central and South America produced by our war on drugs, okay? So from my point of view, it's like really all hands on deck. Like we need the IR people working on this, we need the mental health people working on this, we need the lawyers working on this, all hands on deck. Thanks a lot.